My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group, Hannah Arendt Center virtual reading group. In a departure from our 8 or 9 year history, we're not doing a single book in our current reading group, but reading a thematic series of texts, chapters, letters, essays on Hannah Arendt and race, a topic she spent, well, I would say the entirety of her life writing about, and she has been, especially in the last few years, become a more controversial figure around this topic, and for a couple of reasons. One is her essay on Little Rock, which we'll read in a few weeks. Another is her essay on violence, which we're also going to read. And then this chapter that we're going to read today, Race and Bureaucracy, which is chapter 7 of the Origins of Totalitarianism, is again one of those chapters that has at least been pointed to by many scholars, or some scholars, as well. Let's just say they've criticized it. We'll have to ask ourselves how we understand it and how you understand it, and see how it makes sense. So I think there's a couple questions to keep in mind as we read a text like this of Hannah Arendt's. To me, the most important one is, does she offer a way of thinking about race, in this case, race and bureaucracy, that is helpful, historically, in understanding the emergence of racism, which is part of what she's arguing, B, conceptually in thinking about the question of race, and C, in our present moment, is there something to take from her analysis of race? A second series of questions is there something problematic, or we could say prejudiced in her account, or is there something racist in her account, as some people have argued? And then a third would be, does that, if it does exist, in some way invalidate the things that we take from her in the first set of questions of, are they meaningful and helpful in thinking about problems today, or conceptually, or in history? I think the answers to all of these questions are complicated, and I don't intend to answer them for you today, but I hope that this discussion will proceed in a way that allows us to think through them together. So this chapter on race and bureaucracy follows right on the heels of the chapter we read for last week, Race Thinking Before Racism, which follows the first chapter in the section on imperialism in the Origins of Totalitarianism. And both of those, all of that, I think, has to be read in the context of the quote at the end of chapter 5 on the first chapter on imperialism, the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie, where she talks about Thomas Hobbes. And what she says, again, to remind us, is that the reason Thomas Hobbes is sort of the unintended philosopher of racism is that his conception of mankind, as not rational but as a reckoning creature, or as rational in the sense of ratio, of reckoning. And his claim that man is thus always seeking to seek power or acquire power undermines the idea of humanity, which he says is the most conclusive symbol of the common origin of the human species. And if that idea of humanity, that we're all part of one human species, is no longer valid, right? If instead we're all individuals and members of tribes and members of races that compete in the acquisition of power, then she says there's nothing more plausible than a theory according to which brown, yellow, or black races are descended from other species of ape, and that all together are predestined by nature to war against each other until they have disappeared from the face of the earth. So if you take the Hobbesian idea of man as a reckoning, power-seeking animal, and thus the war of all against all, it's natural, she says, that race emerges as simply a factor in the struggle for power, which is why she says that race is the end of humanity, and racism is the end of humanity. If that's the case, right, which is what she argues, and then in the chapter 6 on race and race thinking and racism, she distinguishes sort of thinking about race from racism, which is this ideological claim of race as a weapon in ideological acquisitions of power. She calls it an ideological weapon of imperialist politics. We now come to chapter 7, where for her, we look at two different phenomena that in her mind originate in the 19th century and that arise independently and yet acquire their real power in conjunction with each other. And those two phenomena are race and bureaucracy. So on page 185, the first page of this chapter, she writes, two new devices for political organization and rule over foreign peoples were discovered during the first decades of imperialism. So two new devices, right? Race and bureaucracy are, in her telling here, devices. And race, she says, is a principle of the body politic. Insofar as it's a principle of the body politic, she says it's the substitute for the nation, right? Now, remember, she's no fan of the nation either. But the nation, at least has insofar as it's connected to the state, as in a nation state, is at least territorially limited. Race is not. So if you're an Aryan racist or any other racist, the body politic you are speaking of has no territorial borders. It extends to anywhere where your racial compatriots are. And so race expands the boundaries and becomes connected to imperialism in that sense, in that it's not limited to a territory or a nation state. The second thing she says about race as a device for political organization over the rule of foreign peoples is that it was the emergency explanation of human beings whom no European or civilized man could understand, right? So it's important to understand here Arendt's claim, and it's a claim she makes not just here, but in other essays and other books, which we'll read later. So, for example, when we read later the Introduction into Politics, one of the things she's going to say is that prejudices always have an experiential basis, even if the experiential basis in a prejudice is deep in history and has been forgotten and is no longer valid. And so in a sense, what she's saying here is that there was an experiential basis that led to the emergence of racism. Now, someone could say, oh my God, that means Arendt is saying racism is justified based on experience. That is not, I don't believe that is what she's saying. And we can talk about that. I think what she's saying is the people and the moment in which race emerged as a concept was based on an experience a group of people had. And if you're going to understand race and why it emerged and what its power is, and if you're going to have any understanding of how to contest it, you have to understand its experiential basis. You can't just say it's evil and bad, poo-poo, get away. You actually have to try and understand it. And she says that the experiential basis of racism in the world, by the way, right? This is an important point, was the encounter of a specific group of people, namely the Boers, right? A Dutch tribe that was originally left with 5,000 people in South Africa and then grew there, with the native population of South Africa. And in encountering that native population of South Africa, they encountered people, she says, whose humanity frightened and humiliated them, right? On the one hand, they frightened them because they were different, but also way outnumbered them. And on the other hand, they saw them as less than human. And the combination of that fright and that, in a sense, less than human inferiority, this idea that they were less than them, led to them needing to enslave them and sometimes kill them and massacre them. And they had to develop a justification for that. And that justification was race. So that race was the emergency explanation or justification. I'm going to use, so you can tell me if you think that's wrong. I'm making an argument here that an explanation, but it was also a justification of human beings whom no European or civilized man could understand, and as humanity so frightened and humiliated the immigrants that they no longer cared to belong to the same human species. And she says 2 pages earlier on 183, remember, this springs from experiences and political constellations. So that's one aspect of it, race. The other aspect of the other device for political organization and rule over foreign peoples, right? That's one is race, is bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, she says, as a principle of foreign domination and as a principle of political organization, is a substitute for government. This is an important point. She thinks that it's a new form of government. Now, remember, this whole book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is an attempt to argue that totalitarianism is a new form of government. It's neither a democracy or a tyranny or a monarchy or an aristocracy. She thinks it's a deeply new form of government, totalitarianism. And one of the arguments is that the discovery of bureaucracy as a new form of government in Africa and also in India by the English and the Germans, helped lead to and was a model for the Nazi bureaucracy and the rise of totalitarianism. But this particular novel form of government, bureaucracy, which is not yet totalitarianism, attracted the best of European intelligentsia, she says on 186. It wasn't, while race thinking always, racism and race and the idea of race always attracted what she calls the worst elements of Europe. Bureaucracy often attracted the best. It was the people who were thought of themselves as intellectuals, as enlightened, and more so as people who would not seek public favor and not seek fame and not seek money, but would rule behind the scenes, administer by reports and secrecy. And they were inflamed, she says, by honest boyhood ideals of the knight in shining armor to protect helpless and primitive peoples. Now, primitive peoples, is one of those words that people have said, oh my God, she talks about natives and she talks about primitive peoples. And she does. One of the questions we'll have to ask is, to what extent that's Arendt speaking, and to what extent she's ventriloquizing, right? The way these, in this case, the bureaucrats saw their people, which and in other cases the way the Boers or others saw people. And I don't think it's an easy answer to that question. I honestly think you can go both ways and see both of them as apparent. In any case, she says that the organization of these bureaucrats was part of the great game of expansion. So the great game being this war of colonial powers, where every area, in this case, Egypt or South Africa, was seen as a mere stepping stone and every people an instrument for further conquest. And her point is that race and bureaucracy thus arose independently. Both would prove central for the modern emergence of totalitarianism. The chapter is broken into three parts. The first is called The Phantom World on the Dark Continent. The second, Golden Race. The third, The Imperialist Character. The first two are about race, The Phantom World of the Dark Continent and Golden Race. The third, The Imperialist Character, is largely about bureaucracy. The first, on The Phantom World on the Dark Continent, what is the phantom world? The phantom world is that the Europe, well, there's a couple elements to it. One is that the Europeans who arrived in Africa were phantoms. They were superfluous men sent to Africa as prisoners, like shadows, she says. They had been spit out of civilization. They were, and here she quotes, I think she quotes Conrad in Heart of Darkness here, living abstractions and witnesses of the absurdity of human institutions on 189, although that may be her. She does quote Conrad a lot here, and I think you can't understand this chapter without understanding that she's basically offering a reading of imperialism here through Joseph Conrad. For Conrad, these men who came to Africa were, quote, hollow to the core. This is on 189. She's all quoting Conrad here. Reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, and cruel without courage. They believed in nothing and could get themselves to believe in anything. Right? This is the character of the people. They were, she says, game for anything from pitch and toss to willful murder. So her characterization of the superfluous white population is very much indebted to Conrad and his reading of the imperialist character. On the other hand, the phantoms are also, in her mind, related to the local populations And again, here's a question whether she's again ventriloquizing Conrad and the whites, or if this is her. And again, I don't know. She writes, the world of native savages was the perfect setting for men who had escaped the reality of civilization. Confronted with human beings who, living without a future of purpose and a past of accomplishment, were incomprehensible. They were inhuman. And yet there was excitement of their humanity. And this is again Conrad. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? When Arendt writes of prehistoric men in this chapter, she puts it in quotes, right? So again, she's quoting Conrad, which leads to a suggestion that she herself is not embracing that view, but is more ventriloquizing it. In any case, for her, the Boers, these Dutch splinter group that isolated itself from European history and spread out across South Africa, that these Boers, in a sense, well, no, not in a sense, in her reading, are the origins of racism in the world, that their encounter with the native populations led them to be deeply frightened, not by color, but by purely natural human beings who lacked a specifically human character. So on 192, she writes, this fright of something like oneself that still under no circumstances ought to be like oneself remained at the basis of slavery and became the basis for a race society. So again, she's trying to understand the experiential basis of the origins of racism. And she's saying that if you look at the Dutch and you look at how they reacted, their reaction was a fright at something that was both human and in their mind inhuman. And that this is the beginning of race. And so she'll argue that the essence of race was not color, but naturalness, the lack of a human-built world, that the Dutch saw the native populations not as humans and yet still humans. And that the Dutch themselves came to mimic the same naturalness and inhumanity that they saw in the native population. So on 194, she writes, the Boers were the first European group to become completely alienated from the pride which Western man felt in living in the world, created and fabricated by himself. They treated the natives as raw material and lived on them as one might live on the fruits of wild trees. Lazy and unproductive, they agreed to vegetate on essentially the same level as the Black tribes had vegetated for thousands of years. Their poverty is almost exclusively the consequence of their contempt for work and their adjustment to the way of life of the Black tribes. So what she's arguing is that what a race society, which the Boers created, in a sense, created a society in which the Boers became mimicked in many ways the lives of the Black tribes that they saw as beneath them. But the one difference was that they saw themselves as superior. And so she says on 195, racism as a ruling device was used in the society of whites and Blacks before imperialism exploited it as a major political idea. Its basis, and of course its excuse, were still experience itself, a horrifying experience of something alien beyond imagination and comprehension. It was tempting indeed simply to declare that these were not human beings. Since, however, despite all ideological explanations, the Black men stubbornly insisted on retaining their human features, the, quote, white men could not but reconsider their own humanity and decide that they themselves were more than human and obviously chosen by God to be the gods of Black men. This is, in a sense, well, I keep saying in a sense because I'm, but I'll say it. This is Arendt's understanding of the birth of racism. It happens with the Boers and their attempt to ideologically distinguish themselves from a group from which they actually didn't have anything to distinguish them, except the fact that one was white and one was black. And this is her argument. She says on 196 to 197, the point, however, is that no matter whether racism appears as the natural result of catastrophe or as the conscious instrument for bringing it about, it is always closely tied to contempt for labor and hatred of territorial limitations, general rootlessness, and an atavistic faith in one's own divine chosenness. So racism appears as closely tied as contempt for labor, right? Because if you're a racist, right, you don't want to labor. You make other people work for you. It appears as the hatred of territorial limitations. It's not a national idea, and that's why she says racists are not nationalists. They're always going to be imperialists or internationalists, and it's based in a general rootlessness, in the sense that the Boers had no home. They kept moving around, and anytime institutions were set up, they would move because they need to avoid institutions, because institutions lead to normalcy, leads to work, and they had to constantly avoid those institutions so that they could simply elevate themselves racially as a master race. And then the third is an atavistic faith in one's own divine chosenness. I think one of the challenges is, she says on 197, the Boers' attitudes had some basis in reality. And the basis, she says, is that they were permanently outnumbered. And the only way to maintain European supremacy was through racism. So I've spent a lot of time on just this first part of the chapter on the Dark Continent, because I think more than any, this is Arendt's argument about the foundation of race and racism. The second chapter on golden race has some very interesting and important parts. I mean, a big part of it is this metaphor of gold as this idea that has no real value, and she's going to say that very much like that, both that race also has no value. But the point of this part for her is on page 206, where she says that race becomes a weapon for domination. And she says on 206, the full impact of the African experience was first realized by leaders of the mob like Karl Peters, this is in the Congo, who decided that they too had to belong to a master race. African colonial possessions became the most fertile soil for the flowering of what later was to become the Nazi elite. Here they had seen with their own eyes how peoples could be converted into races, and how simply by taking the initiative in this process, one might push one's own people into the position of the master race. So the argument here is that what Karl Peters and others did was simply realize that low-level mob, superfluous people could, simply by taking the initiative, by calling themselves superior and violently suppressing another people, could elevate themselves and make themselves into a master's race. And she says this is, in a sense, what the Nazis learned from the imperialists. There's some very interesting parts in this chapter about the Jews in South Africa. Basically, ways in which the Jews at first were connected to imperialism, but then actually became disconnected from it. And yet, in either case, the Boers saw the Jews as the main enemy, except for the blacks, and they saw the Jews and the blacks both as the great enemies of their racial society. The third and final part of this chapter is on bureaucracy and the imperial character. I love this section. I think it's incredibly important. It's not as important for our reading of race here, but the idea is that if race is a way of governing, is a device to govern a way to govern and politically organize rule over either local or foreign people, bureaucracy is a way to govern and organize rule. And the key to bureaucracy is that it is a government of experts, and thus an experienced minority, which has to resist as well as it knows how the constant pressure from the inexperienced majority. So bureaucracy is anti-democratic. This is on page 214. It's not only anti-democratic, it's always elitist. And that's why she says that it attracts often the best and the brightest. She says on 215 that bureaucrats are the instruments of incomparable value in the execution of a policy of imperialism because they degrade men. They make, what bureaucrats do is say that we men who are bureaucrats simply are part of a bureau and we follow rules and we implement them. We lose our initiative and our freedom. And so men are made into, quote, secret and anonymous agents of the force of expansion who felt no obligation to man-made laws. The only law the bureaucrats obeyed was the law of expansion, and the only proof of their lawfulness was success. And thus on 216, she can write, at the basis of bureaucracy as a form of government and of its inherent replacement of law with temporary and changing decrees lies the superstition of a possible and magic identification of man with the forces of history. The ideal of such a political body will always be that the man behind the scenes who pulls the strings of history. The bureaucrat allows you to dominate foreign peoples because you set yourself up as ruling for their benefit, which obviously she says you're not, but you do so in a way that you hide and you become a secret player and you see yourself in a positivist sense, in a positive sense, as helping history to develop, whether it's progressivism or enlightenment or the white man's burden, as she talks about it through Kipling or whatever. So just to sum up, these are two devices for political organization and new forms of government: race as a principle of the body politic, bureaucracy as a principle of foreign domination. All right, I'll stop there. That's a lot. Reminder, look, there's a lot of, I think, fascinating and complicated and difficult ideas here. Please, in the chat, please be respectful and have arguments about the ideas. Doesn't mean you can't make your positions known, but please be respectful and treat each other with that respect. Also in the conversation. So there's two ways to engage the conversation. One is through the chat, and one is by raising your hand and engaging the conversation with all of us. And I look forward to, I hope, a fascinating conversation. I find these chapters to be really important and fascinating. Okay, Vivian, you're up first.
Hi.
I can, but you're a little muted. So can you speak loudly?
Yes. Is this better? Is that better?
Yeah. Now I can hear you better.
Okay. I'm not going to keep you guys long because libraries have been written on all of this: the history of imperialism, capitalism, the colonization of Africa, South Africa, race studies. So I'm not going to keep you long, but full disclosure here, I am a white Jewish South African born with one set of dead Polish grandparents murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis. My paternal grandparents, my paternal grandmother who brought us up was an Afrikaner, a Boer, as the Americans used to call Afrikaners, born on a strawberry farm outside of Cape Town in 1906, married a man way too Jewish for her. She was half Jewish, but the wrong half. My grandfather was Ukrainian, Russian, and went to South Africa in 1917. So I had to disclose this because my heart races when I read this word Boer, which as a sort of inventors of racism, the word and rootlessness and non-working people, because the word Boer actually means farmer. Farmers work pretty hard. It's true that the Afrikaners hated the Jews second only to Black Africans. That's definitely true. That's all of my growing up years in South Africa taught me that every single day. But the idea that the Nazis copied the Boers, some kind of template for racism, is so crazy because the Boers were unfortunate. I guess those Dutch who colonized South Africa were the unfortunate detritus of white Europe and imperial Europe. And everybody copied the imperialists and everybody copied the capitalists. I can't, when I think of the British, and the brutal Boer Wars, I am not defending the Afrikaners, but the British who disrupted in the most brutal, lasting way the indigenous Black populations that were in Southern Africa by introducing forced currency instead of traditional bartering or trading, that made Black Africans into impoverished slaves, and the British who invented and constructed the first concentration camps there for the first Boer War. All of this, I just wanted to put that out there. And I won't take much more time, because for somebody who doesn't know these most important things in the history of brutal colonialism and imperialism, might think that it was as simple as that the Boers invented all of this. And it just doesn't make any sense to me that way. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Vivian, I want to. I'm going to mute everyone. All right. I want to thank you for saying that, and I think it's an important corrective, and it reminds me to say something that I had wanted to say, and I think I didn't, which is to say, Hannah Arendt was not a historian, right? And one of the things that has happened, especially to this book, but also other books she wrote, is historians have come around and said, oh, she makes this mistake, she makes that mistake, etc. And I'm sure there are mistakes. What is she trying to do in this book, right? She's trying to offer what she calls the elements of totalitarianism. One of which is racism, another of which is bureaucracy. And she's trying to understand racism, and she's trying to understand bureaucracy. She's using the Boers to try and understand racism. Is she giving a nuanced and full account of Boer life? Absolutely not, right? I think that's an important point. And I think Vivian's response to that is, that doesn't, if I understand her point, it doesn't reflect her experience of, the Boers as someone who's, 1/4 or some odd Boer and grew up in South Africa. And obviously I know Vivian well, not, someone who would be deeply offended by this kind of racism, both against Black South Africans and against Jews. But what Arendt is saying is offering is a reading of what she sees as a fundamental experience, what she calls the fright, and it's an experience that one finds in Bohr writing and Bohr speaking about this in the late 19th century. So long before she was born or around, Vivian, I mean. And Arendt takes this experience and takes what she sees to be the Bohr's retreat from an antagonism to all governing institutions, to all stable institutions. The fact that, Vivian said they were farmers. Well, you were farmers, but they were spread out because the land was not very good, and they had to have huge farms, and they lived, she says, in clans, and much more so than in towns, and all of this is part of Arendt's reading. I'm no expert, and I all I can say is I'm offering an attempt to understand Arendt's reading of the situation. If there are mistakes in it, it's helpful to point those out. I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet that anything's been said that makes me question the general understanding of racism. Although I'm happy to have that conversation, because I think that's in a sense the important conversation to have.
Can I just say that I don't disagree with you, and I'm actually not even saying that Arendt has made a mistake, because I think I would have to read it all very much more closely, and that's just too much for me to do. I just want to say that imperialism, European imperialism, is a lot older than the advent of the Boers, and I just want to emphasize that. I'm not saying even that Hannah Arendt does not say that or imply that or anything like that. I just want to put it out there because some people listening to this today may just, a more superficial takeaway may be this thing with the Boers, but I just can't blame European imperialism enough for where we are today. And that's what I want to emphasize.
Great. And also, Arendt does believe that imperialism starts, in the late 19th century. That doesn't mean, again, there are precurrents of it, but that's where she thinks it begins. And she does think it begins to some degree in South Africa, both with the Boers, but also with Cecil Rhodes, and also with Lord Cromer in Egypt and Cruzan and then also people in India. So, but that's just part of our discussion.
That's not incorrect. I guess that I took imperialism to be very much earlier. I'm thinking, for example, of the European opium trade, which was really exploited by the British, and the general colonization of other continents by the European powers. So I guess that's what I meant.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is, as she'll say, there's a difference between mercantilism and colonization and imperialism, and that's what she's talking about. But I mean, again, she's not a historian, and I don't think she's largely taking this reading of imperialism from I think his name is Hobson, who she cites continually on that question. But we'll move on from that. But thank you, Vivian. I mean, it's an important point, and I don't think the point of this chapter is to say Boers are bad. That's not the point. In fact, what she wants to say is the Boers had an original experience. No, she thinks it's an experience that led to something that has been catastrophic. But this is not an attempt to demonize a group of people. And I think it would be a mistake to read it that way. Peter Nelson.
Thanks. I thought the second part of the chapter was helpful, given that I find the Holocaust a quagmire of questions about who we are and what we do with other people, to explain the bureaucrat as, although she says he's like a god, it seems like it describes him more as at the service of policy and process, And that service allows perhaps the Christianized nature of the bureaucrat to be abandoned in the sake of purpose. And I thought that was helpful. I found it more curious on the issues around race. You mentioned the one about experience, or she says experience helps explain race, but actually it maybe gives vitality to race. It's just hard to imagine it could be experience would precede race, because you'd have to first believe in a distinction between people based on skin color. So, or the other claims of racial difference. So racial difference would have to precede any experience, and then the experience is read through the lens of the preceding racism. Not that different from a Supreme Court making a decision where the conclusion probably precedes the evidence they're looking for to make the conclusion true. So that was strange to me. I like that you call it ventriloquizing, but I'm never sure if she really means savages and dark continent, but she uses them both many, many times, and also seems to almost make equivalent, again, perhaps I'm hoping in the minds of Europeans as opposed to her, that human is somehow synonymous with Western civilization / European civilization / maybe British civilization. So that did leave me wondering about who was speaking in those cases.
Thanks, Peter. Just on the last point quickly, I think her idea of human is not European. It's anyone who tells a story of man's building a world on top of nature. For her, and this goes to the human condition, man is a split being, right? Between one who's given and one who fabricates and builds a world. She talks in this chapter about, how the Asian civilizations, Native American civilizations, and she says even the African civilizations were civilizations, but the Boers saw them not that way. Now, again, I don't mean to say she's right about all the Boers, but that's how she reads it. And that was the experience that led to this. On the bureaucracy question, I think what's important to realize is that the bureaucrat, on the one hand, the bureaucrat follows the rules, right? You go to the EPA and you say, I want to do this, and say, nope, I can't do this because of that rule. Go to that guy, and you go to that guy, and they say, no, I can't do this because of that rule, and you go to that guy, and it's like they nickel and dime you by the rules, and it just seems like life is about to end because you can never get anything done. On the other hand, the bureaucrat is the one, because they are not elected, and because they are sort of operating in their own office, they can sort of skirt the rules and skirt the laws. And the bureaucrat is one who can actually get things done beyond the laws. Now, that's their choice, right? And when you go to the bureaucratic window at the DMV or at the EPA or wherever you're going, you want the bureaucrat to say, come on, just do the right thing. And they can if they want. They often just don't want to. I mean, it's also important around, this is in a sense her reading of Eichmann. I mean, one of the hardest and one of the most contested parts of her book on Eichmann in Jerusalem is that, on the one hand, Eichmann presents himself as a mere cog or a functionary. And Arendt talks about the fact that Eichmann was a bureaucrat and a functionary. On the other hand, Arendt is clear that he was not someone who simply followed the rules, and that he often took initiative and went beyond the rules to do what he thought was required of him not by the rules, but by the spirit of the rules. And that's very much what she means by a bureaucrat. And I think it's one of the reasons that so many people who read Eichmann in Jerusalem, people like Deborah Lipstadt and Bettina Stengneth and many others, and I think just don't get the book because they don't understand what Arendt means by a bureaucrat as she expresses it in these chapters. So a bureaucrat for her is someone who rules in some sense in secret, who rules outside the law, and thus very much can set themselves up as a god. And that's part of the connection with race. The organization of society by race sets up one group as a god. Bureaucracy sets up one group as a god. Together, a racial bureaucracy, right, sets itself up as a god who can rule in secret according to the inner workings of history, and are justified by that. And if the inner workings of history are the victory of and the eventual victory of the working class, right, that's one. And if the inner workings of history are the victory of the Aryan race, that's another. And that's the kind of combination that she sees emerging in this chapter.
Right. Just if I could not push back, but just add, I think it's the bureaucratic and racist mindset allow for two things. One, the losing of a better angel, certainly in the bureaucratic space, if my only concern is process. I guess I'm thinking just the average person. It doesn't mean I have to do this as a bureaucrat, but I have the capacity, once I'm covered in the cloak of bureaucracy, to abandon what I thought were my values and go for process, because process becomes the driving force, the North Star. In the case of racism, it allows me, and I think this is the more horrific part, that I perhaps become a god, but basically it cloaks me in the capacity of human beings to combine power with imagination, because it's not just the killing of Africans, it's the torturous way it was done. It's the highly violent ways that require really somebody to put a lot of time in how horribly I want to kill this person on top of killing the person. Killing the person to begin with should be a thing we can't imagine, and maybe we can claim that for the godly power of racism, but why would a god behave in such a way? And that has to be animus as well. And what's the explanation for that without attaching to racism highly valued negative characteristics in the target? I'll drop out at this point.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate it. I think all that is right. I take that as you said pushback, but I'm not sure where it pushed back. So I'll just accept that because I don't generally agree. Miriam.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. This struck me as I was reading the chapter, the comment that Arendt made that there was no built world. From the Boer's point of view, there was no built world. And I just wanted to ask you or anybody present, because I'm ignorant of African architecture, especially at contact period, if you want to comment on that. And I would just like to know what was built.
No, it's a good question, and it's one of the, I think it's one of the more common critiques of Arendt that people have made. I'll point out to you on page 187, footnote 4. Right, one of the things that when I teach this book, I make the students read every footnote because the footnotes are exceptional and often long and quite interesting, but it's hard to read them and read the text. So on footnote 4, I got to take my off to read these things. She says, it is important to bear in mind that that colonization of America and Australia was accompanied by a comparatively short period of crew liquidation because of the natives' numerical weakness. Whereas in understanding the genesis of modern South African society, it is of the greatest importance to know that the land beyond the Cape's borders was not the open land which lay before the Australian squatter. It was already an area of settlement, of settlement by a great Bantu population. And she's citing here someone named C.W. de Kweet, A History of South Africa and Social and Economic. I point that out because it's just one of the few places where she actually, at least quoting Kweet, who's actually one of her main sources, seems to recognize that the African population was not simply, was not, as the Boers thought, completely unhuman, but actually had a civilizational aspect to it, and it was not an empty, unsettled space. In fact, she's often more clear that it was the Boers who lived in these very wide, separate places with, you could only see the smoke of your neighbors, as she puts it, that were for her more rootless and more unbuilt in their civilization. Again, I'm no expert either, Miriam, but I think there is some aspect of it, where these tribes were nomadic. I think I assume partly true, although I don't know. And so, I think there's probably, again, the point is the Boers had this experience. There has to be some truth to it, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's the full truth. And I think, like most prejudices, which then can turn into racism, and we'll get there in a couple of weeks, they emerge because of an experience which has some truth in it, but it's usually not the whole truth. And I think that's one way to understand this. If anyone knows, there's no doubt that there was a civilization there, and it wasn't just a natural, people who had no human civilization. My understanding is that what she's talking about, insofar as she presents it that way, is the way the Boers experienced it. And yet, I will say there's no doubt in my mind that Arendt probably shared some prejudice that nomadic tribes, whether they were in Africa or Central America or the United States or in South America, are to some degree less developed and less civilizationally developed than civilizations, whether they're in Europe or Asia or wherever, that are more settled and tell more stories and have institutions. That's her bias. And I don't think you're going to run away from that bias, and I don't think you should run away from that bias. In fact, there may be people who want to defend that bias. Part of her argument, if you read the chapter on gold and race, I think one of the most interesting parts of it is she says that by the early 20th century, the two parts of the South African population that had become most civilized were the Blacks and the Jews. And she says, because the Jews ended up leaving the financial area because they got kicked out by the English, and they ended up creating factories that made furniture and things, and thus they became part of a settled community. And she says, in the gold and diamond mines, it was the Blacks who took jobs and started working, whereas the Dutch didn't work. And she says the Black South Africans actually became more human and more part of human civilization than the Dutch. So, from my point of view, Arendt's prejudice is there, right? That people who work and build institutions are more human, but it has nothing to do with a racial element.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Roger, sorry, yeah. But I don't know whether to laugh or cry at that. The idea of the Black miners who lived in barracks that looked like Birkenau, single-sex barracks. I don't even know where to begin with that. And her timeline, here the timeline is just hokey. Something wrong with the timeline there. But the racism of the Boers, and I think, as I say, it's just South Africans don't really talk about Boers, but rather Afrikaners, I suppose, was so sort of primitive, nothing like, and this is not a defense, I'm not saying it's better, but it's so different from the insane kind of, let's say, stereotypical Nazi type racism that had, all the ersatz middle-aged histories and the Teutonic heroes and those all the Valkyrie and all the Wagner myths and things and all the rubbish monuments and all these lies that built into it, and the obsession with aesthetics and the whole history of aesthetics and the whole weight and meaning of this aesthetics and philosophy and everything. It was so primitive, and the relationship with the Boers on the land and the indigenous African populations there were more, let's say, feudal than in the historical time in which they lived. So just, yeah.
Thanks, Vivian. I appreciate that. Oh, Greg.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to try to sort out two things here to help us think through this chapter. One is Arendt's own attempt to explain racism, and two, how her own racism as a person, possible racism as a person, may have influenced the analysis. So I think her analysis of racism as a phenomena, it's, as she says, it's very Conradian. And ultimately, I think what she's trying to do is explain how imperialism destroys the imperializer. And meanwhile, writing African peoples out of the story. But in terms of explaining racism, I think, none other than Achille Mbembe, who's one of the world's leading scholars of decolonization and racism, uses her argument to make his own point about the rise, what he calls Black reason. So he's validating her whole argument, specifically the stuff that we're talking about right here. So to me, that says her explanation of racism is pretty strong. But on the other side, so how does her own possible racism influence this analysis? And what strikes me about this chapter, especially on the Boers, is it's got this really strong echoes of kind of 19th century social evolutionism in it. And this is out of step with her own writing about politics elsewhere in her work. And if she had been attuned to, I'm an anthropologist, even the anthropology in the 40s and the 50s, which wasn't always in lockstep with colonialism, she'd have seen lots of examples of council politics, whether you're talking about hunter-gatherer peoples or pastoralists or people settled in whatever kind of system. It was available, it was written, it was in the literature. If you're a Western academic, you could find it, but she never picks up on it. So, I mean, I think that's a kind of filtering mechanism that would have allowed for a richer explanation of what's going on in Africa. At the same time, so it's a missed opportunity in my view. At the same time, her whole point here is to try to explain the implosion of Europe, right? And this is where that Conradian point comes in. And Conrad was brilliant at showing how imperialism destroys the imperializer, despite his silencing of African peoples. But again, the point was to show what's happening to Europe. You could say that's Eurocentric, but she took on a Eurocentric question. What are the origins of totalitarianism? So that's how I sort of shake out on all this. And there's of course lots to talk about here, but I'll just leave it at that and see what yours or other people's feedback are. So, thanks.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate it, Greg. I mean, I think everything, I don't think there's anything you said. Well, there's one thing I at least question, but what you said about her explanation of racism, which is that how imperialism destroys the imperializer, I think is right. I think you're right that her explanation not only accords with Achille Mbembe, but also with Ibram Kendi in his book Stamped from the Beginning, which I talked about last week. I think Kendi's idea that racism emerges as a justification for discrimination, not out of original hatred, is exactly very much along Arendt's lines. The difference is Arendt seeks to understand it as arising from an experience, which Kendi does not. But I think you're right. I think it's a very powerful explanation, which is one of the reasons I've decided to have this couple month inquiry into her thinking about race, because I think it actually is meaningful. On the question of her personal racism, you said it has echoes of social evolutionism and is out of step with even some of her own work. There I'm not so sure. I mean, very much her idea in the human condition is that humans are conditioned beings. And what conditions them is the world they have built and the artifice of that world. And part of the aspect of the human condition is that since humans are both natural and given into the world, but also build their own world, to be human is to, in some sense, be part of a built world. Now, where I think you're absolutely right is that the African tribes or peoples, whatever I don't know, the African peoples had a built world, right? And that's what you're talking about. They had council politics, they had an economy, they had institutions, they had laws. Does Arendt know that? I think she does. I mean, I read that quote from the footnote before from the Kvit article. I think she knows it. I don't think that's, and I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't her question. She wasn't sitting here trying to show that the Africans had a built world. She was trying to show what happens to a European people who think of the Africans as not having a built world, as purely natural. And she's interested in a Eurocentric question of the origins of totalitarianism. And she is interested in that and not worried about people thinking that she's going to be prejudiced or racist writing it, because she sees herself as a Jew suffering from this. And that's, she thinks she's on the right side here. We can look back on it and say, she said things that sound problematic today. But I do agree with you that this was that this is less an expression of racism on her part and more an expression of trying to understand the way in which a European encounter in European eyes led to imperialism, bureaucracy, race society, and was one element of the beginning of European totalitarianism. So I want to thank you. That was a great point. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Catherine Lee? Yeah.
That's me. Thanks. So I really appreciated your comments about the ventriloquism. I literally, towards the beginning of the first section, at one point I set the book down and I was like, wait a minute, does she mean that like ironically? Like, is she kind of like saying this? I don't even know what the phrase was, but like with sort of a wink. Is she using someone else's words? Should this be in scare quotes? And so the first question is, do you have, and because I like Arendt, and I want to, I want to sort of assume the best of her. There are times when I'm getting kind of like cringy, like reading bits and pieces of this, that I am motivated to read her sympathetically. But I'm wondering if you can help us, like, are there clues when there might be some kind of ventriloquism going on? Or is that just maybe us? I think most of us on this call, like, we're not hate reading Hannah Arendt, like we're here because we want to learn from her and think she has some good things to say. But like, how could we know the difference? And then the other thing, especially the section on bureaucracy, again, in a way that both like made me cringe, but also made me, like, in a sad way, kind of want to laugh. There's so many of her comments on bureaucracy that reminded me of my involvement in the world of NGOs and even in kind of intentional communities, like places where there's, in the best ways, good intention for people sort of like coming in and working on behalf of a community and embedding themselves in a community, but with a sort of like unseen hand and not, wanting to control, but not have too much control. I kept thinking about nonprofit boards that I've been on, where there is this literal unseen hand of bureaucracy in the background, supposedly trying to do good things, but often acting in really racist ways, and mucking things up in ways that are really harmful, just because of the function of bureaucracy and general wrongheadedness. But yeah, I kept thinking about those sort of analogies in the modern world of like our smaller sort of bureaucracies that we've set up. So,
yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. So on the when someone sets out to read a text, there's different ways you can read it. You can read it in order to support your thesis, or you can try and understand what the author's trying to say. And, there's this idea of authorial intent is one that many academics no longer believe in, right? That it's impossible to get to and things like that. Again, I think it's helpful to remember also the way people read her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? They took things where she quoted Eichmann or quoted Hausner, and they said, Arendt's saying this. No, she's quoting these people, and she's doing it often explicitly, ironically, and explicitly with an aspect of, and people took it to be what she said. I think a lot of the critics of Arendt have done the same thing reading this chapter. You asked for, are there clues, right? Yeah, I mean, I gave you some of them. When she talks about prehistoric, she puts it in quotes when it's not quoted from somebody else. When she does use scare quotes a fair bit. A lot of the things that people find most problematic, like prehistoric or savages, are quotes from Conrad or from other people. And clearly Conrad is trying to, criticize people who call these folks savages. And I think Arendt is, I use the word ventriloquizing. Can I prove any of this? No, I can simply lay out the information. There are going to always be people, right, who are going to read this and say, she's a racist. And you're seeing a lot of that today. In fact, there are a number of people in political theory and around this country who are actively trying to argue that Arendt should be canceled and shouldn't be read or taught. And that's their opinion. I think they're wrong. I think probably on this call, I have some sympathy on that, but it's worth hearing that view, and it's worth responding to it, which is why I've tried, and I'm glad to have the questions in this to say, look, these are things people can disagree about. I can lay out, my reading of it. I'm not willing to say that she had no prejudices, because everybody has prejudices, and she clearly had prejudices, but I don't believe, that she thought of them as savages or things like that in the sense that we would, but you can certainly take things out of context and quote it and make it look as if she did. On the question of bureaucracy, I think I fundamentally agree with you. She calls bureaucracy a rule of experts that's at odds with the democratic will. To me, this is one of the biggest questions today, right? She's worried about she says at one point in her essay, I think it's on violence, that the rise of bureaucracy is the greatest threat to freedom in the world today. In Egypt and India, bureaucracy was the rule of European experts in the name of civilizing and exploiting native populations. One has to ask, as I think you're suggesting, maybe I'm going to make it a little more controversial than you're suggesting, but you tell me, what is the role, what role of domination of peoples, the bureaucrats and nonprofit boards and government and corporations serve today? Who are they dominating? Who are they seeking to rule against the democratic will? I think if you begin to answer that question, you're going to get some pretty uncomfortable and potentially fascinating insights. And I don't think there's only one answer to it. But clearly, people who are in nonprofits are trying to rule the people they're trying to help with the best or worst of intentions, depending on how you see it. And they see their rule as more just and more necessary and more important than the will of the people they're trying to help. And that's we should at least be honest with what nonprofits are trying to do, which is to dominate and rule and change in their own image of what they think should happen, the people they're trying to help. Then you have bureaucrats in corporations, and what are they trying to do? And then you have bureaucrats in government, and what are they trying to do? And why is there such a rebellion against experts in government today around the world? And that may suggest to you who these experts are trying to govern, or who they need to control in some way. So I think reading that section is also quite important. It's one reason we'll read Arendt's essay on violence in a couple of weeks. I forget the exact order we're reading in, but pretty soon. And near the end of it, and I point this out so that when you read it, you pay attention. And near the very end of it, she has a couple of lines and then a couple of long endnotes, which I really encourage you to read the endnotes and on violence as well, especially near the end, where she argues that the rule of experts today is a racial rule of experts against non-experts. Racial in the sense that it's a rule by those who claim to be smarter and better over people who they think of as inferior. And she says that this racial rule based on intelligence is the greatest racial danger of the future. And I think that to understand that fully requires reading a number of her texts, including this one, which is why they're all being read together here in this group. So thank you, Catherine. Ken, you're up.
I'm puzzling over her use of racism. We've been talking about racism and its roots in reality, and I actually think when it becomes an ism for her, it's often doing just the opposite, which it's occluding reality. And I think when she's talking about racial thinking, I think she's saying that has its roots in reality. But I think when it comes to racism, her emphasis is actually on how it hides reality and some really essential reality, like namely that our humanity is shared. And the way that she's using the Boers to me is really kind of essential in that. That the way I see these chapters, well, first of all, there's something about Hobbes that I wanted to bring up, which is that for me, the most important part is the reason she's using Hobbes and not Marx, who she could use for naturalizing things, is because of where she says that the bourgeois interest is in making money from money. I own a business, and that was interesting to me because I thought of myself as like, I finally own the means of production, and here I am exploiting the proletariat. I really should be on top. And then I I read this, that the bourgeois intention is actually just to make money for money. What I'm doing is actually nothing the bourgeois wants to do. Like I have to manage people, I have to take care of machinery. And that seemed like the basis for the next, the argument about imperialism, that it was really just to, the only way it could keep making money from money was to keep exploiting people as effortlessly as possible. And bureaucracy seems like one aspect of that. But that would account for a certain kind of racism, but not the kind in the concentration camps. That would account for racism being used functionally. So if the concentration camps were work camps, that would make sense. But she clearly says they weren't, that they were there for other reasons. So what becomes interesting to me, and the way she's using the Boers, is where economics and the sort of sensible uses of racism get turned on their head, and racism gets divorced from reality and used in itself. So the essential sentence to me on that is on page 206, where she's talking about the most important lessons for totalitarianism, which she says that through sheer violence, an underprivileged group could create a class lower than itself. Yeah. That she says that what they learned from race society is that profit motives are not holy and can be overruled, that societies can function according to principles other than economic, and that such circumstances may favor those who, under conditions of rationalized production in the capitalist system, would belong to the underprivileged. South Africa's race society taught the mob the great lesson of which it had always had a confused premonition, that through sheer violence, an underprivileged group could create a class lower than itself. That for this purpose, it did not even need a revolution, but could band together with groups of the ruling classes. And I think that explains the KKK in this country. It explains, voting in this country, where people just would prefer to push another group down rather than raise someone else up. And as much as she's probably being unfair to the Boers, it seems like that's a really important point. And not where racism is any longer based on reality at all, but it becomes an ism for her, divorced from realities and taking its own interior mojo.
Thank you, Ken. That's excellent. So yeah, I mean, the idea that you're expressing is one that Arendt makes explicit in her long sort of book project that never gets finished, called Introduction into Politics, which we'll read. Again, I forget the order we're reading in, but pretty soon. And in that, she makes a distinction between prejudice and racism. So at different points in her work, she makes this distinction in different ways. So in the chapter 6 that we read last week, she makes a distinction between race thinking, which are free opinions about race, and racism, which is an ideology. On violence, she makes the distinction between race and racism. Here in this chapter, she makes a distinction between race and racism, or race and bureaucratic suppression. And then later, she makes a distinction between prejudice and racism. I think the point in all of them is what it relates to something you said, which is that prejudice and race thinking, or not race, and race are always have some experiential component or basis. And as long as they still have that experiential component and basis, the prejudice, A, can last, but B, can be challenged and weakened if you do the hard work of showing people who hold that prejudice that the experiential basis is no longer valid. And she actually defines politics in Introduction into Politics as the effort to dispel prejudice, right? So you're absolutely right when you say that there's a difference between sort of race and racism. And what she's, doing here is showing how there was sort of on the one hand, an experiential basis to race, and then how that experiential basis transforms itself into a kind of ideological, violent, non-experiential elevation of one people over another. This idea that through race we become a god, or through bureaucracy we become a god, and that's the sort of double. Those are the two different ways that we leave our experiential basis in reality. And the paragraph you point us to in 206 is crucial, right? Because the whole point of that is that we lose an experiential basis. That just like in the Holocaust, the camps were not useful for the war effort. In fact, they were counterproductive, but they were governed by a racial need to exterminate Jews and other groups. The society in South Africa was set up on a racial basis that was not about the profit motive and was not useful, but was simply designed to keep the race society alive, even when it was counterproductive to economic and political power for the society. And that she says this lesson about the birth of racism is what the Nazis learned, right? I forget who said before that the Nazis didn't. I don't know, but she does think that this is what, in a sense, racist societies, whether the Nazis or the Ku Klux Klan, learned, if not directly, implicitly from this imperialistic process. So absolutely, and I think what you've said is right and important. Let me just go straight to Gilbert because we've only got a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure I get his comment in. Hi, Gilbert.
Hi, Tusa. Thank you very much. So mine is not a question, but is a comment. As the conversation of today is very, very interesting. And as I am very much motivated by those who contributed, such as Peter, such as Kathleen, such as Ken, such as Vivian, please receive my deepest appreciation into my heart. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gilbert. And let me echo that. I mean, look, this could be a terrible conversation very easily. People are, and I want to say that this has been excellent. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope you have as well. And I'm glad, Gilbert, you did. You guys have been spectacularly thoughtful and serious and really engaged a very difficult text, both conceptually and politically, in a way that at least I found inspiring today. So I want to thank you, and just gives me great pleasure to be part of this group that we've had now for almost 9 years. Some of you have been here for 9 years. Some of you are brand new, but thank you for being part of it today. We'll continue next week. I forget what the next reading is, but it's on the website. Does anyone know off the top of their heads?
It's the politics.
Introduction into Politics. Okay. So really do pay attention in reading that into her distinction between, well, it's about prejudice and about the prejudice against politics. And the prejudice against politics is a prejudice in favor of experts. And so in a way, this is about a prejudice against the people in the favor of experts, but it's also about prejudice in general. And so there'll be comments about racial prejudice and religious prejudice and others, and the distinction between prejudice and racism, and how politics can and cannot or should not dispel prejudices. So think about that as you're reading the text. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I look forward to the conversation next week's. Thanks very much.